Hello and welcome everyone. I am Tom McDermott, Regional Resource Director for Greater Pennsylvania and Ohio at Caron Treatment Centers. In partnership with Glennar Koch and Associates, LLC, we thank you for joining us for today's presentation, Relapse in COVID-19, Finding Hope in Recovery. Today's presentation is eligible for 1 credit from the Pennsylvania Certification Board. Please keep your Zoom session open at the end of the presentation to access the post-event evaluation to obtain your 1-hour credit. In order to receive your credit, you must stay on for the duration of the webinar. Once you have finished the evaluation, we will email you a certificate of completion within 2 weeks. As a reminder, we will be conducting this session in webinar format. All participant microphones will be muted. During the presentation, please utilize the Q&A feature to ask any questions you may have. Depending upon the volume of questions, if we can't get your question before the end of the hour, we will have someone from our team follow up with you directly. Now I'd like to begin welcoming our presenters. Dorothy Diamond is the Clinical Supervisor of Men's Treatment Services at Caron Treatment Centers. Dorothy's been with Caron since 2006 and has worked on various adult inpatient units, including Women's Phase 1, Men's Phase 1, Men's and Women's Relapse programs, as well as Men's Phase 2. She is credentialed as a certified advanced alcohol and drug counselor through the Pennsylvania Certification Board and is a licensed professional counselor through the Pennsylvania State Board of Social Workers, Marriage and Family Therapists, and Professional Counselors. Now I will turn over to my buddy, Jason Kamara, to tell you about our co-presenter, Jeremy Falgout, and share a little bit about Glennar Koch and Associates. Jason.
Great, thank you this morning. Good morning, my name is Jason Kamara. I'm the Program Director at Glennar Koch and Associated. We are located in Allentown, Pennsylvania, near the airport. And we are a private practice who's been specialized in both mental health, trauma, and substance abuse for the past 35 years. And typically with age groups of anywhere from as young as the age of 8 all the way up into adulthood. I'm here to introduce a colleague of mine, Jeremy Falgout, who is going to be one of our presenters today. Jeremy is a nationally certified counselor and licensed professional counselor who's worked in both the fields of addiction and mental health for the past 9 years. He holds a master's degree from Indiana University of Pennsylvania with a specialization in clinical mental health counseling and a concentration in substance abuse disorders. Additionally, he is a certified grief specialist as well as a certified complex trauma practitioner. He has experience working with both individuals who are in crisis or struggling with suicidal thoughts, as well as victims with trauma. Jeremy is a firm believer in the development of strong therapeutic relationship and employs the Gestalt-based approach, aiding individuals with trauma finding healing through the resolve of unfinished business.
I think I'm muted. There we go. Thank you very much, Jason. And I'm going to turn over the webinar to Dorothy and Jeremy.
Okay, guys, welcome. So today, some of our learning objectives are going to be what to look for. One of the big things that we as providers need to be aware of first and foremost is like what to look for in one of our loved ones if they're looking at any additional stress factors, right? And then how to identify resources that are going to be safe and effective to help that individual back to a place of calm, sobriety, and whether that is through AA, NA, inpatient, or outpatient treatment, okay? And also how to provide specific tools to maintain that sobriety, at least for a brief period of time, so they can get to where they need to be, okay? So with that being said, I'm gonna turn it over to my partner here, Dorothy.
Next slide, please. So I think, you know, what we're going to do and how we're going to proceed is Jeremy's really going to take the stance, guys, of speaking from an outpatient basis as far as the trends he's been seeing, approaches he's been taking, and what's been working. And I'm going to take more of an inpatient lens as far as what have I been seeing and what have we been doing on an inpatient basis. And so we want to start off by saying, what are we seeing as it pertains to COVID-19 and relapse on an inpatient basis? And I just want to take a moment and just backtrack and just honor that for the purpose of this presentation, we are going to hone in on COVID-19 specifically and the impact that's had upon the people we're serving. But I think that we would be remiss if we didn't honor and acknowledge that there is so much more impacting people's lives these days, both economically, financially, politically, societally. There is so much impacting the people that we are serving. So we need to honor that. We need to acknowledge that. And COVID-19 and the pandemic has definitely been such an incredible, huge curveball the past year. But I think over and above that, we've had multiple other curveballs. So we just want to honor that and acknowledge that. So what I want to start off by doing is really telling a story. For anybody who listens or reads Brene Brown, I really appreciate her. She calls herself a researcher, but also a storyteller. And that really hones into me because my preference is to tell stories. And I think that those can be examples of what's happening on a much bigger level. So when I want to speak about what am I seeing on an inpatient basis regarding COVID-19 and relapse, I just want to tell one quick story of a man I'm actually working with right now who attributes 98% of the reason as to why he relapsed to COVID. And when he tells his story, he talks about all the ways his life has been impacted due to COVID. He talks about his twin boys who were seniors this year, and all these pivotal life events for a young man at that time got turned upside down. He talks about them being active in crew and him being a loving and active father as part of their crew team. And the moment their crew ended, it not only ended for them, but it also ended for him. And in that swift moment, he lost social interaction and he lost a sense of purpose. He talked to me about his daughter who had a work-study experience at Disney that abruptly ended. So once again, she's hurting and she's in pain, and now she's home, which then adds another stressor of all these individuals and bodies in the home environment. And he's like, I couldn't even find a comfortable place just to be in my own home. He goes further to say, my mom then had a hip replacement. She broke her hip, had to have a hip replacement, and I couldn't visit her. I couldn't see her. This is a man who was a first responder, and he couldn't be there for his own mom and the devastation of breaking her hip, which was incredibly painful. He talked about his own discomfort being in his home. He talked about his own work life experience and loss of work and lack of structure and accountability. And he just talks about how COVID really sandwiched him between pain and pain. And ultimately what he said was, Dorothy, this left me with a lost sense of worth. This left me feeling helpless. This left me with a lost sense of purpose and mission. And he said, I was hurting incredibly, but as the patriarch of my family, it was incredibly hard and difficult to see my family hurting. And once again, it left him feeling helpless. So I paint that picture because we could go on and on about all the ways people have been affected by COVID, but that is one picture of one gentleman who got hit and barraged from so many different vantage points. And I think that that's one example that is a great example of what so many other people out there have endured and gone through within the past year. And it's just been pain upon pain. And when you look at that one story and you want to even amplify it, that then leads us to the idea of what are the red flags that is going on to help us see when people are getting off track and perhaps engaging in a relapse process. And you talk about unstructured time, isolation, lack of structure, lack of purpose, things like that, feeling helpless, being scared and confused. These are all the things that are the red flags that then contribute potentially to a relapse process. So I could keep going on, but I just wanted to hone in on that one story and to say on an inpatient basis, both with our men and the women that we're serving where I'm at, that is one story that really amplifies and helps to paint a picture of what almost all our patients are saying. Jeremy?
Thanks, Dorothy. So a big thing that we're seeing in the outpatient perspective, especially in our particular program, is the clients that came into the whole COVID-19 pandemic with identified supports, with good structure bases, with good coping skills, okay, they're being able to maintain their rate of sobriety at a much higher rate opposed to clients that are coming into treatment during the midst of this whole COVID pandemic. So over the course of, say, 6 months, we had a lot of clients in our program that were doing great, right? And when asked why they were doing so great, okay, they noticed specific things such as having a good support system, having structure, and not having a lot of change, right? Opposed to the clients that came into the program as a reactionary method, right? So these clients came into the program after having relapsed. And all those clients that came in all had some of the same things in common that the clients that were already in treatment already had, right? And those clients that came into treatment were losing their loss of purpose, helplessness, loneliness, right? Being cut off from their support and loss of structure, okay? Not very much unlike any of the things that Dorothy just talked about there, right? So in 2019, the Health Resources and Services Administration did a study, right? And nearly 50% of Americans noted that loneliness was a major detriment to their mental health and substance abuse patterns. Okay. Now, that was in 2019 before COVID. Okay. Come COVID, that number went up. Right? So over half of Americans now are noting that the mental health crisis related to the pandemic has greatly impacted them. And a trend that I've seen is that not only is that impacting more people, but it's impacting age groups of all ranges, right? Especially young adults who are being cut off. Right. So that's a really big trend that I have seen specifically in the outpatient perspective, is that clients that were already in treatment seem to be doing much better because they have identified supports, resources, and coping skills, opposed to clients that are coming in as a result of other losses, whether it be job, house, relationships due to COVID. So that's a big part of the outpatient perspective. And Dorothy's going to take us into our next slide.
So part of what we want to talk about is clinical interventions and what's working prior to a relapse. So basically, this is more about relapse prevention and how to engage clients on both an inpatient and outpatient basis. And part of what I want to say, guys, is I've been saying this to a lot of people in preparation for this. This isn't rocket science. I wish I could say that we have some newfound idea that we can say this is what works. And sometimes it's not about the new ideas, but the old stuff that just remains true, and just reminding ourselves of the old stuff and just really leaning into it and amplifying it. So what works to help people stay sober and minimize relapse? It's about connection. It's as simple as that in my mind. It's about connection with other people. It's about connection with others who can remind people on a daily basis that they struggle with a disease that needs daily attendance to, connection to something greater than them, whatever that looks like for them. It's different for everybody, but just connection. I think that we need to support and encourage the utilization of a support system as much as possible. And in doing that, that presents some potential barriers for us in the work with our clients. One of those barriers is denial. The main symptom of this disease that keeps perpetuating it is denial. And the patients that we work with, when they fall back into denial and using defense mechanisms, they love to rationalize, make excuses, intellectualize, so on and so forth. So I really think it is our job as clinicians to help challenge some of that distorted thinking in a loving manner, so that we can minimize them from making excuses to pull away. Because we know that relapse is a process. It's not a solo event. There's a lot of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that lead up to the culmination of the pickup. Our goal is to try and intervene upon that process before the pickup occurs. And one of the things that happens in that process for many people is isolation, pulling away. So we need to encourage people now more than ever to pull in and not away. If they start to make excuses, we need to challenge that. We need to talk about resources such as Zoom and 12-step meetings or self-help groups that are available via Zoom. I don't know about you guys out there, but for me, I work with a lot of patients who have an aversion to Zoom, and they make a lot of excuses as to why it doesn't or can't work for them. And I think part of our job as clinicians is to reframe that a little bit. I think part of it is allow them to vet and be honest about what I would call are the limitations of Zoom, but those limitations don't need to be barriers. For our clients, if they start to enter into some distorted thinking, it's very all or nothing. It's very black and white. And we need to support them in seeing the gray. And we need to support them in saying, yes, you know what, let's honor it. Zoom is not the same as in-person meetings. Let's just call it for what it is. But more importantly, it's what we have. So let's use what we have to the best of our ability, and let's have it be perhaps a limitation, but not a barrier. For me personally, in my professional work, I feel that a tool and an intervention that has been imperative is just the encouragement and recommendation of the utilization of spiritual principles. I know that in these days, it can be incredibly hard to find gratitude, but it's imperative that we do so. Acceptance is pivotal. We are combating a disease in which people lose control and experience an degree of powerlessness. And sometimes the antidote to that is acceptance. I keep saying that COVID has been a great opportunity to learn how to pivot time and time again, and has been one of the greatest life experience to practice acceptance. So I do believe that one of the interventions that we can encourage with our patients and those that we serve is to utilize spiritual principles in their daily lives. There's so much more I could keep saying and keep contributing, but those are the things that come to the top of my list. Jeremy, what do you see as working?
So one of the big things that I see as working specifically in the outpatient area is connectivity. Okay. So during the whole COVID pandemic, I worked from the motivational interviewing perspective, right? So I really worked to meet each and every one of these clients where they're at, right? And taking that and having them kind of like work through some of the resistance that they're seeing, not only in their own individual struggles for sobriety, but also like in maintaining their overall sense of wellness and mental health, right? So during the course of like our relapse prevention group, I would help the clients connect with each other, right? So that when they're in their own respective communities, they have their own like individualized support network, right? And through that process, each of these clients grew to the point to where they were able to confront and challenge each other's maladaptive coping mechanisms in the group process. Okay. And that wouldn't have been possible without like just meeting them where they're at and encouraging connectivity. Okay. And as a result of that, these clients form their own support network, and they now have like weekend outings, right? They'll go out and they'll all get together and go play frisbee golf together, or they'll plan a dinner night, or they'll play Zoom games, right? Loss of structure and connectivity was one of the biggest contributors to relapse from at least from my personal perception, right? And having the clients be able to work through that collectively in a group process is super important, right? And I work from some of the models that Dennis Daly and Antoine Douahy work from, and I got to work under them in when I worked in Pittsburgh. And the interventions that I learned there through motivational interviewing have been huge in this process, and being able to help these clients develop connectivity, not only in a group, but being able to say like, okay, I can apply this skill outside of my group and be able to develop wellness and creativity in sobriety. Because let's face it, AA doesn't work for everybody. It just doesn't. Spirituality doesn't work for everybody, right? You have to meet the client where they're at and roll with their resistance and help them find what works for them. Okay. And some of them, okay, it's going to be something completely off the wall. Like I got a guy right now that one coping skill that he learned that's been helping him through the pandemic, he learned how to tie flies, like for fly fishing. Okay. And not only has he gotten really good at it, but he's like making money with it now, right? Something so simple can be so profound. So that's a big, big piece of what I do with my clients in terms of clinical intervention is really just meeting them where they're at, helping them develop connectivity, and really, really focus on wellness and challenging their own behaviors as well as others' behaviors who are around them. And that seems to be working. It may not always work for every single client, but it seems to be working at this point in time. Dorothy?
Thanks. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at what we just talked about is some of the engagement prior to a relapse, but unfortunately then some of our clients and our patients do relapse. So what we want to talk about is once that occurs, how do we re-engage them in the therapeutic process? How do we support them and reinstall a sense of hope? And then we can also talk a little bit about what portion of clients are we seeing attribute their relapse specifically to COVID-19 and the ways that it impacted their life. So I guess, from an inpatient perspective, I have three main points that I want to hone in on. The first is thorough assessment. The second is quality treatment. And the third is comprehensive aftercare planning. And that's from an inpatient perspective. So on an inpatient basis, once again, not rocket science, not new information, but assessment now more than ever is critical. We need to be talking to our clients and learning about not only about the chemical relapse, not only about how the pandemic has been affecting them, but how everything else outside in our world that is impacting so much of all of us, how is that impacting them? I come very much from a strengths-based perspective. I don't personally see relapse as a failure. I often use the term stepping stones. So when I work with clients who've relapsed, I want to identify what were they doing before that worked, and maybe what is something that just needs to be tweaked. We don't even need to say that it needs to be completely changed, but what needs to be tweaked. When we talk about quality treatment, I worked with a gentleman lately who made a statement to me, and I'd be lying if I didn't say that it didn't convict me when he said it. And he said, please just give a person who relapsed a chance to speak, even if they're wrong. And I really had to take a moment and just breathe and take that in, because when he said that, I said, man, how true is that? It comes down to some of the basic foundational blocks for us as clinicians about the idea that we just need people to share their story. And it needs to be done with no judgment. It needs to be done with no lecture. That doesn't mean that on occasion we might not challenge or reframe some stuff, but at the basic core, when we're doing that assessment and just getting to know people, people just need a safe space to tell their story. We know the concept that a burden shared is a burden halved. And one of the things that this gentleman said to me was, when you take the time to sit and listen to me, that then makes me want to take the time to sit and listen to somebody else because somebody did it for me. And he said, look, we are intelligent people. We often know our relapse warning signs. We often know what tripped us up. We just need to talk about it, get it out there and share it. So to some degree, especially with all the events of 2020 and even entering into this new year, there's a part to this in providing quality treatment that I almost want to encourage, that we should encourage and support people in a little bit of a process of mourning, because I think that there's some grief just overall for many of us within the past year of how these events have impacted us. And once again, just providing people a safe place to do that. And I think using techniques like Jeremy mentioned earlier, which I very much utilize, like MI, that's the approach I take. I'm very much of an MI clinician. I'm very person-centered. I think that's what works for me, and that's something that I encourage. The third point that I just want to hone in real briefly on is comprehensive aftercare planning. One of my guys said, to me recently, I forgot what the joy was in sobriety. So part of his treatment while here was us helping just to try and remind him of some of the promises, try and remind him of some of the joys, but then also set up an aftercare plan where he could continue to be surrounded by people who could support him, love him, challenge him, and also continue to remind him of the joys that can be seen in longer term sobriety that is achieved. I appreciate what Jeremy said earlier, because I think with aftercare planning, it's not just about literal treatment or the utilization of self-help programs, but it's also about how do you fill your time through hobbies and things like that. So I think that that's important as well. And once again, with aftercare planning, just learning and identifying what are the supports you're going to utilize, how do you develop and utilize those supports, and how do you increase comfort with platforms like Zoom if you're not comfortable with them just yet. So when it comes to inpatient treatment post a relapse, in my perspective, the three things that are just critical is thorough assessment, quality treatment, comprehensive aftercare planning. Jeremy?
Thanks, Dorothy. So a big part that I like to focus on in re-engaging somebody in the therapeutic process starts well before they relapse. Okay, and that starts from the first individual session and the first group session, right? Individual norms and group norms, like making the client like feel comfortable enough to be able to even express to you that they've relapsed, right? Because we as professionals know that when a client relapses, they're going to go back to maladaptive behaviors and avoidance and any other like negative way of coping that they can to escape any sort of negative feeling or accountability. So I like to start that engagement process right out the gate and like letting them know that it's a safe place for them to be able to let us know as professionals and as like a group facilitator, right, that they've relapsed, right? Because these clients are carrying enough guilt, shame, and embarrassment with themselves on a daily basis that they don't need us to add any of it because they're beating themselves up enough as is, right? So, and like Dorothy said, like being able to really just take the time and sit there and listen to your client, right? Really take the time to listen to them because you know what? Sometimes like you may think that they're just gonna come up with some BS excuse when reality, like they actually may be in a place where that they can take accountability for it if you can give them that time and space and respect, right? Because if clients don't feel respected and valued and that their thoughts and feelings are important, they're not going to be honest. And the most important thing we have in re-engaging a client in the therapeutic process is that of the therapeutic relationship to begin with. If you don't have a good therapeutic relationship with your client or with your group, it's going to be really hard to re-engage them. Now, we fast forward a little bit, you've got a great therapeutic relationship with that client, okay? Being able to re-engage them, it still may be difficult, but you at least have that relationship to fall back on, okay? And then you can start pulling other resources in, like being able to engage the family, okay? Being able to get that client re-engaged with their identified supports and activities. Because when we look at that, that's like one of the biggest things that clients relapse for is because they're in emotional distress. So I got a statistic here for you, right? So a federal emergency hotline registered more than a 1,000% increase in the month of April of last year. 1,000% increase. That's over 20,000 people texted that line more than had been in the past, right? And SAMHSA did the same thing and got the same result. Okay, so what does that tell us? Clients are relapsing at an alarming rate. Why? Because of unprecedented change. Okay, change that is happening so swiftly that they don't even know how to deal with it, cope with it. So where do they go? They go to their former maladaptive coping mechanisms, right? So we have to be able to recognize that, okay, and be able to reel them back in, right? And when I look at this, a lot of my clients, now I don't have a specific number on this, this is a very subjective number, but a majority of the clients I have seen recently, and when I say recently, I'm saying the last 6 months, that have relapsed have all been COVID related. Now, some of that we have to take with a grain of salt, right? Because some of them are going to just fall back and use that as an excuse. We know this, right? But look at what's going on, like all the political drama that's happening, loss of jobs, financial stress, moms that are stuck at home with their kids and that had to quit their jobs to stay home with their children and end up relapsing because their whole structure was flipped upside down, right? If we don't have a safe place for these clients to turn, we're not going to be able to re-engage them, right? But we first have to know what's going on around them as a way to like kind of support them, right? Support them through legitimate social and personal relationships, also helping reconnect them with creative solutions, right? And like I said on the last slide, that the traditional approaches aren't going to work for everybody, especially a lot of our younger demographics. They're a little bit more difficult to engage sometimes. So you have to be more creative and engage them in a different way. You can't fit a square peg in a round hole, right? So that's a lot of how like I see re-engaging them post-relapse. And let's be honest, it's not always going to be effective. That client has to still want that help. Okay? But if we can be that consistent source of support and fall back on that therapeutic relationship, you're going to have a higher likelihood of re-engaging that client through their support network than you would if you didn't have a good therapeutic relationship. And yes, doing that via Zoom is very, very difficult. But Zoom can very much be a positive tool even after returning to the office. Next slide.
So can we just stay on that slide real quick? Because I just want to speak a little bit about that last thing and just a couple things that I've seen. Couple thoughts. One is I think that in an inpatient basis, what I've seen, I would say almost all patients are attributing their relapse to some degree regarding a COVID issue or some kind of consequence or life stressor or life impact that if you trace it back, it had a correlation to COVID. I'll also say, which is really interesting, I've also talked to a lot of patients recently who commented that they were well into a relapse process before COVID even hit. And the reality is COVID hit and then it just amplified the actualized relapse. And then what that then did was precipitate a quicker entrance into inpatient treatment that might not have been or might not have happened otherwise. I don't know if we want to call that a silver lining or what, but I've had multiple guys say, look, I was already on the slow burn and I was already going downhill. And if anything, COVID was just gasoline to the fire, so to speak. And it just helped my world explode faster. But in doing that, it also helped me to seek treatment faster. So that's been a very interesting thing. What I'll also honor, and dare I say, maybe this is another silver lining, I'd be really curious, Jeremy, if you've had this experience, is a lot of what it might have been barriers to engaging in treatment before is no longer there. Obviously for like men, I work with men, and like leaving work, for example, is a tremendous difficulty in their lives to come to inpatient treatment for a month. And nowadays I've worked with so many men that they're like, because of COVID, that's opened up the door to me seeking treatment in a way that before just might not have been possible. So in an interesting, ironic way, COVID has also made available some opportunities or maybe minimized some barriers to seeking treatment that might not have been there before. Just out of curiosity, Jeremy, have you had that experience at all?
Yeah, actually I have. But because of like the whole telehealth thing, it has given people a more of a resource to stay consistently engaged in treatment. And like, let's face it, like life happens, like kids got soccer games and you've got work and you've got other obligations. And a lot of times people will forego their treatment for those other things. But when you offer them like, hey, like we can keep you engaged, we can continue to support you. Okay, what about telehealth? Would you think that would be an option for you? And a lot of clients have like spoken to how much they've liked the telehealth, like so much so that I've got clients asking to stay telehealth permanently even after the COVID pandemic. Now, for clients that are in substance abuse treatment, Okay. Sometimes that can be smokes and mirrors, right? As a means to kind of avoid accountability. But there's measures you can put in place with that. For myself, once I go back to the office full time, it'll be okay. I can see you once every 3 weeks in the office if you want to do telehealth, or once every other week, right? But I do see a higher degree of clients wanting to stay engaged because they now know that this is an option for them. So let's just hope, keep our fingers crossed as practitioners and providers, that the insurance companies stay on par with this. Because if we can get them on par with this, just imagine how many more people we can engage and touch and support through this telehealth platform.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeremy. Next slide, please. Part of what we want to talk about is just, some of what we've used as tools and adaptive coping mechanisms that's working on an inpatient and outpatient basis. And I'll just comment briefly on some of the things that I see. And once again, not incredibly new information, not rocket science, and still at the building blocks, it's critical. I almost want to use the term mind, body, soul. Those are the things that we need to be working with our clients on to develop coping skills and self-care practices so that they can tend to their mind, their body, their soul. This includes exercise, nutrition. It includes mindfulness and meditation. Once again, I'm going to hone in on this a little bit, but like a sense of spirituality. And I don't mean spirituality in the religious sense. I mean spirituality just in the sense of having connection with something other than yourself, whether that's with nature, whether it's with a group, whether it's with other people, having some source of connection. I interviewed all the guys on my unit recently, which were 20 men on the inpatient relapse men's unit, and something that I did not anticipate, but what quickly became up as a pattern, because literally every single one of them mentioned it, is that what was lacking in their program before contributed to their relapse, and something that they know is imperative to implement moving forward is some form of spirituality. Now, what that looked like for each one of them was 100% different. They all had their own individual, unique ways of going about this, which I'm all about. But the word that they used over and over again was, I need spirituality, I need connection. So once again, not rocket science. These are basic building blocks, but things that we need to hone in on. One of my guys said in a very pivotal way, remember to put yourself first, continue to help others, and don't be afraid to ask for help. At the most basic level, that's what we're encouraging our clients to do. We're encouraging them to have an instilled sense of worth and purpose in themselves, to know that they are worthy of putting themselves first, to know that they are worthy to ask for help and allow others to enter into the process with them and serve them and help them. And then once they are in a better spot, to help pay that forward and be of service to other people. So when we talk about what are the things that we want to encourage our clients to do, those are some of the things that come to the top of my mind. What do you think, Jeremy?
So a big thing that comes to mind for me, I'm a little bit on the other end of the spectrum, but they are definitely correlated, is adaptive coping mechanisms through wellness solutions and creativity. Because you get a lot of clients out there that have tried everything. They've tried the journaling, they've tried the spirituality, they've tried the mindfulness, they've tried yoga, they've tried all these different exercises, right? And just something's just not connecting, right? Whether it be on their end or whatever it is that they're trying just isn't for them. So what I like to kind of work with the clients on is identifying those mechanisms that might be out of the box and considered to be non-traditional, right? Because if you have the right tool, you can fix the broken part, right? But sometimes you can use another tool to fix that same broken part. And what I've found is like helping clients really connect to their creative side has really kind of like invigorated them and given them like that sense of purpose back. Like, but more importantly, instead, like not only with the sense of purpose, it is reinstilled hope, right? And when you give someone hope, it motivates them and it makes them a dangerous person in a good way, right? Because it really gives them that drive to do something that maybe they think that they weren't even capable of before. I used to work with a guy when I lived in Pittsburgh, and I'll never forget this guy because he was one of those people that he he just had an excuse for everything, right? And when he came into treatment with me, he was using everything under the sun, like multiple substances, long history of criminality, right? And over time, he was able to slowly get off the heroin, get off the crack, get off the meth, and then he got to the last thing, and that was marijuana. He just couldn't kick it. Okay, and no matter what I threw at him, coping skill wise, coming out of the box, okay, it didn't work. Now, mind you, this is a big dude. He's like 6'3", like 240, like a big muscular built guy, right? And I asked him one day, what about coloring? You know, one of those adult coloring books. He goes, are you crazy? Get out of here with that. Right? And I just left the coloring book on my desk. Now, 2 months go by. One day he just comes in and picks it up and starts coloring. Right? And he just takes it, walks out the door and takes it with him. I didn't say anything. I just let it ride. Okay, then he comes back 2 weeks later and the coloring book is full. And when I say it's full, like it's every page is colored and it looks stellar. Okay, so this invigorated the creative process in him so much so that he started taking coloring classes, shading classes, art classes at his local art studio. Okay, fast forward 4 years, he's completed a degree in art through the Pittsburgh Institute. Okay, and now has his own coloring book line. Right, and that's something that we see a lot of success with. Right, but because that came from the creative side and something that was very much out of the box, okay, it was able to engage him in an area of his life that he had never been engaged before, which is the creative side. Okay, and that can be a very, very effective modality. Right, so I try really not to underestimate wellness and creativity because they can go hand in hand. But that's like probably my two biggest mechanisms that I use is like wellness coping mechanisms paired with creativity, exercise, dieting, healthy eating paired with other creative means fit to the client under that umbrella of motivational interviewing. Dorothy?
So next slide, please. So I think that to continue that discussion, which I appreciate what you just said, Jeremy, with wellness and creativity, part of what we want to talk about is not only how do we apply wellness and creativity to the individuals we serve, but also to ourselves. Caitlin, can you switch to the next slide? So with that being said, I'm not going to read these definitions, but I think that it's something that I would encourage you to read and just remind yourself of, because I think that as clinicians, something that we are prone to struggle with no matter what, but especially in the midst of all the events of the past year, is the concepts of burnout and compassion fatigue. And when Jeremy and I were preparing for this webinar, I just said to him, I said, Jeremy, it is on my heart, this idea that we are meant to be the torch bearers of hope for the people we serve, but who's there for us? You know, the reality is everything, for the most part, and in large part, that the people we're serving, what they're going through, we too ourselves are going through it, you know, and we're getting hit left and right. And we're the people who are meant to be there of service to other and hear them and listen to them and problem solve with them. But then we're taking that all in, and then it's a question of what are we doing then to take care of ourselves? Parallel process. A lot of the pain they're going through, we are going through right now as well. And once again, I don't mean to overcomplicate this. If anything, I like to keep things really simple, but parallel process, the things which we perhaps encourage or recommend to our clients for them to do for their own self-care are absolutely things that like we can do for ourselves. So we just want to hone in on that and at least take a moment to comment on that, because I think that we would be remiss if we're talking about all the ways we are to be of service to others. But in the midst of all that's going on, we need to be of service to ourselves. And we all know that we are no good to other people if we are not taking care of ourselves in a good and decent spot ourselves. Jeremy, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more. And you guys have all heard me talk about and drop these two words like multiple times throughout this whole presentation: wellness and creativity, right? But we have to recognize our own bounds, our own limits, our own red flags, right? If we're not recognizing those things, we're in breach of our overall goal, right? Because under the ACA Code of Ethics, okay, what is the overarching goal? Okay, to do no harm. Okay, and if you're counseling a client when you're not well, okay, you could potentially be inflicting unintended harm upon that client. Okay, because that really sets a precedent for potential transference, okay, unhealthy relationships, boundary issues, you name it, right? Okay, it just opens a door for a whole bunch of not good stuff, right? And being able to recognize burnout in yourself, okay, is really important. Okay, so as providers, we need to be able to set a good example. Okay, when to reach out to our own supports in our own lives as well as our professional lives. Like I've got great support at Glenn Koch. Jason's an awesome director. I'm able to reach out to him when I need to bounce something off of him. And periodically, he'll even check in like, hey, how are you doing? Is there anything that I can do for you? Right. And as a provider and as a coworker, okay, that is so important to our own emotional well-being. Right. We have to be able to recognize that. I'm going to read you guys something. I cannot take credit for this. This is a meme that a friend of mine sent me. So I can't take credit for it. I don't know who wrote it, but it really, really speaks true to our profession. And I hope that you guys agree with me. So in 2020, therapists counseled people through a global pandemic, an economic crisis, a politically polarized election, a racial justice movement, chronic uncertainty, anxiety, and depression, with no preparation, with no warning or specialized COVID training. Okay, while we all went through the same things ourselves. Right. Okay. So if there was ever a time to value our profession and value ourselves for what we do, it's now. Okay. And how we do that is maintaining our own wellness. Okay. Supporting each other so that we can support our clients in the most effective way possible. Because our overall goal is to do no harm and help people improve their quality of life so that they can reach their own personal goals.
I appreciate that, Jeremy, because I think it really comes down to how do we implement self-care? How do we implement a healthy work-life balance, so to speak? You know, Tom McDermott, who introduced me at the beginning of this, I can think of 3 distinct conversations he and I have had in the past week where, yes, we were talking professionally about patients we're serving and conceptualizing their cases, but without fail, every single conversation was also talking about the events in this world, our reaction to it, how we're being affected by it, how we plan to take care of ourselves and move forward. So I appreciate, Jeremy, this idea of utilization of supports both professionally, but also personally. And I just think that now more than ever, it's critical. Anything else, Jeremy, before we go on to the next slide?
Nope, we can go on to the next slide.
Okay. So the next slide, everybody, is just with the contact information, just for both Jeremy and I. I'll speak for myself. It has my email and my direct confidential work line. If there's anything following this that anybody wanted to discuss further or process or questions or just problem solving that, like, you know, I'll speak for myself. If I can be of any kind of support or assistance with, feel free to email me or call me. I'll leave to Jeremy as far as where he's at. I'm perceiving he'll react similarly, but I just want to let you guys know that it is an open invitation. We cannot do this alone. We need to be of support to one another. So please feel free to reach out to me if I can be of any service.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, on the slide, you've got our office address and office phone number and my confidential work cell phone number. So feel free to call me, email me with any potential questions or feedback. I'd appreciate any feedback, and I'd be happy to answer any questions as well. So next slide. So right here, guys, we have listed a list of resources that are really good for wellness and helping connect clients to different types of support groups. Okay, feel free to check them out on your own. They're really great stuff. They're supported by the WHO and NAMI, which are very reputable resources. So feel free to check those out. Next slide. And here is the list of the resources that we use to put together today's references or today's presentation. These can be sent to you via PDF at the end of the presentation. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions about them. Next.
Thank you, Dorothy and Jeremy. So we did have a couple of questions. I'm not quite sure who talked about Zoom games that can promote connectivity. Somebody was asking if there are some examples, or is there a specific website that people can go to for that information?
So yeah, that was me, Tom. So there is one specific game that my clients have used, and it's called Evil Apples. It's very similar to the game Apples and Apples, but you log in all via like the app, and then you play the game right on Zoom. And it's a really good way to keep clients engaged, but also like just picking a random board game and being able to have your clients play those games throughout their time. I have had some success with Monopoly, a shortened version of it, because I mean we all know how Monopoly goes. Monopoly like can end friendships and relationships if not played. So we have to set really good boundaries and ground rules with that one. But Evil Apples is really a good one. Realistically, any app-based game that can be played as a multiplayer, to where you have access to your phone and Zoom can be used. I like to use the Evil Apples game because it's very seamless and no transitioning issues. So that's a good one. Check it out. Yeah, great question.
Okay, so this is also a question for both you, Dorothy, and you as well, Jeremy. Came in kind of similar to what Tom's question was. It's about how to keep clients kind of engaged with attending Zoom recovery support groups. You know, how do you kind of work them through that? I know that, Dorothy, you spoke a little bit about that. So can you kind of elaborate on how to work with clients and help them stay engaged in attending these meetings?
I think for me personally, you know, if they're having difficulty engaging, well, then we need to ascertain what the difficulty is. Like we need to process and discuss what is the limitation, even if it's perceived, what do they perceive the limitation or the barrier to be? You know, we can't force this upon people. We can't pressure it upon people. I think we can encourage it. And if there is some aversion to it or hesitancy, like let's talk about it. You know, we talk about in recovery that, you know, some of the principles we strongly encourage is honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. Let's just be honest and talk about it. And can we encourage them to be willing to try something new on for size? So how do we encourage engagement? If they're struggling to engage, I think it's a matter of looking at why are they struggling to engage, and can we try to work through some of those perceived or actualized limitations, and maybe even reframe some of their thoughts about that. Jeremy, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, mine's a little bit different. Mine comes from two perspectives. It's a systematic perspective in the aspect that like each one of my clients, they get through our electronic health record system, they get text reminders, number one, right? Mm-hmm. So that's an accountability measure to make sure like they can't say, oh, I forgot about group. Well, you got a text 24 hours in advance and 48 hours. So okay, that takes that off the table, right? But again, like really like a lot of it really falls on the facilitator and the type of environment that you create via the Zoom and trying to engage them. Because if you're just continually talking at them and as if it's a lecture, they're not going to engage. They're not going to hear anything you're saying. So I really focus on getting the clients to speak to one another, right? Really focusing on their facial expression, just like I would in an in-person group. Focus on their facial expressions, their body language. Ask them like, hey, I noticed you had a reaction to what Johnny said. Is there something that you would like to talk about, right? Not letting those type of things slide just because you're not in the room with them, right? Which does take a lot of focus and attentiveness, okay? And if you're not being mindful of your focus and attentiveness, okay, how are you going to expect your clients to be? Okay, so I really focus on like really kind of getting them to talk to each other opposed to directly to me. And that's one thing that I have found to be like super successful. And That's why I've been able to maintain a 90+% show rate throughout COVID. Very rarely do I have somebody not show up, but more importantly, they don't just not show up. They give me notice, which is really not something that's typical. Like a lot of times early in my career, clients would just no show, just with no notice. They wouldn't care. Okay. But they've developed a vested interest in the group and the support. So they'll notify me 24 hours in advance like they're supposed to. So I've found that to be very successful.
So we still got a couple of minutes left. So I'm going to ask a question. My experience has been one of the biggest tools we challenge our folks in treatment, whether they're an inpatient or outpatient, is to change people, places, and things. And a lot of the people, places, and things that they're going to be going home to are some of the challenging factors that were some of the factors that caused the relapse, like having to work remotely from home, the financial strain. I mean, we're still kind of in the same environment. How do we coach people to navigate that?
I might take a moment to think on that. Jeremy, do you have an initial thought?
It's for me, it's all about just like really engagement. I mean, really focusing, falling back on that therapeutic relationship that starts from day one, and not coming at it from a reactionary perspective. One of my mentors, who actually used to be the CEO of Karen Foundation, Bill McCabe, once told me, and it took me a while to get this through my thick skull, was listen to understand, not to respond. Which goes right back to what Dorothy was talking about earlier in the aspect that like sometimes you just gotta just sit there, shut up, and listen. And that's gonna be the ticket. That's gonna be the key. And that's what I've found to be successful. I mean, I don't know about you, Dorothy. What do you think?
I mean, I think that makes sense. And I think that like it goes back to some of what you were talking about before, Jeremy, which is just like, how do you get as creative as possible to attend to and mitigate some of these difficulties? For me, it's about how do you build in structure and support? How do you build in accountability? How do you build in connection with people? And how do you attempt as much as possible to mitigate some of those people, places, and things with the understanding that you might not be able to mitigate them all. So it's not going to be black and white, but you do the best you can with what you have. And so just trying to be honestly, like also like really realistic with people as far as what is reasonable, what is possible, and what are some things that maybe you might need to have some acceptance with, and what are some things that absolutely could change. So let's talk about what that needs to look like.
Well, we are at that time. I want to thank Dorothy and Jeremy for an amazing presentation. Thank you, Jason, Glennar Koch Associates, for partnering with Karen. And as a reminder, we are offering 1 PCB credit for today's presentation. Survey will be posted for you to take immediately following this presentation in order to obtain credits. Again, you must have been on for the duration of the presentation to get credit. You will receive a certification of completion in the next couple of weeks. Karen Treatment Centers is pleased to provide some additional continuing education opportunities in the next couple of weeks. Topics, dates, and details are listed on your screen now. All webinars are complimentary. Visit karen.org/webinars at any time for more information. Please reach out to your local regional resource director at any time for additional information, resources in your area, or questions regarding admission to any of Karen's programs. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great afternoon.